August 2nd, 16 BC, southern Italy. 50,000 exhausted Carthaginians stared across a dusty plain at 80,000 of Rome's finest legionaries, the largest army Rome had ever assembled. By sunset, 50,000 Roman bodies would carpet the earth in history's most perfect massacre. Think about those numbers for a second. Hannibal was outnumbered nearly 2-1. The Romans had every advantage: more men, better equipment, home territory. Yet in 6 hours of butchery, Hannibal achieved what military historians call the perfect battle. By the end of this video, you'll understand how one tactical formation destroyed a superpower's army in a single afternoon. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see ancient warfare forever. First, the crescent formation that turned Roman strength into a death trap. Second, why 70,000 men died while barely moving from their positions. And third, the simple cavalry maneuver that made escape impossible. But here's what makes this truly unbelievable. How did Hannibal convince his outnumbered, starving army to stand and fight? Why did the Romans walk willingly into the most obvious trap in military history? What tactical principle did Hannibal invent at Cannae that armies still study 2,200 years later? And how did one afternoon of slaughter nearly erase Rome from existence? To understand how 50,000 destroyed 80,000, we need to step back 2 years to when Hannibal first crossed the Alps and made Rome's nightmare real. 2 years before Cannae, Roman senators laughed when reports arrived that a Carthaginian general was marching war elephants over the Alps in winter. By the time they stopped laughing, Hannibal had already slaughtered 2 Roman armies and was burning his way through Italy's heartland. The man they dismissed as a barbarian upstart had studied Roman tactics since childhood, and he had come to Italy with one purpose: to destroy Rome so completely that the city would never threaten Carthage again. At the Trebia River, he'd annihilated 40,000 Romans. At Lake Trasimene, he'd butchered 15,000 more and drowned Consul Flaminius himself. But Rome refused to surrender. Instead, they did what Romans always did when facing defeat. They raised an even bigger army and prepared to crush the foreign invader through sheer numerical superiority. It was the logic that had built an empire. It was about to lead to the worst military disaster in Roman history. Hannibal Barca wasn't just a general. He was a weapon forged specifically to destroy Rome. His father, Hamilcar Barca, had fought Rome in the First Punic War and lost. Before Hannibal turned 10 years old, his father made him swear a blood oath at the altar of Baal Hammon. He would be Rome's eternal enemy. The boy spent his entire youth studying how Rome fought, how Rome thought, how Rome could be beaten. By age 26, he commanded Carthage's armies in Spain. By 29, he was leading 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants across the Alps in October of our logistical nightmare that military experts said was impossible. The crossing killed half his army. Men froze to death on narrow mountain passes. Elephants tumbled off cliffs. Avalanches buried entire units. When Hannibal descended into Italy in late 218 BC, he had fewer than 50,000 survivors, exhausted, half-starved, and seemingly doomed. Rome mobilized 40,000 fresh troops under Consul Publius Cornelius Scipio to crush the invaders before they could recover. Here's what Rome didn't understand. Hannibal had just done the impossible, and impossible was his specialty. December 218 BC, the Trebia River. Hannibal faced Consul Scipio and his co-consul Sempronius with 40,000 troops. The Roman army numbered 42,000. Well-fed, well-equipped, confident. Hannibal lured them across an icy river at dawn, then ambushed them with hidden cavalry and infantry he'd concealed in ravines overnight. The Romans fought in freezing water, soaked and sluggish. By noon, 30,000 Romans lay dead or dying in the snow. Hannibal lost fewer than 5,000 men. Think about that ratio. A 6-1 kill advantage while outnumbered. But Hannibal wasn't satisfied. He spent the winter preparing his next stroke. June 217th, BC, Lake Trasimene. Consul Flaminius pursued Hannibal's army along a narrow road squeezed between mountains and the lakeshore. It was the perfect ambush site. Hannibal hid 40,000 troops in the hills overnight. At dawn, when Flaminius's 30,000 legionaries were strung out along the road in marching formation, unable to deploy for battle, Hannibal sprang the trap. The Romans never had a chance to form ranks. They were driven into the lake or cut down where they stood. 15,000 Romans died in 3 hours. Flaminius himself was killed in the melee, his body found days later, trampled beyond recognition. Hannibal's casualties, fewer than 2,500. 2 catastrophic defeats. 45,000 Roman soldiers dead in 6 months. Any other civilization would have sued for peace, paid tribute, negotiated terms. Rome's Senate voted unanimously to reject any peace talks. They would not negotiate with the barbarian who dared invade Italy. Instead, they ordered the creation of the largest army Rome had ever assembled. 8 full legions, 80,000 men, backed by allied troops. The message was clear. Rome would bury Hannibal in Roman bodies or die trying. What they didn't realize was that Hannibal was counting on exactly that response. He had studied Roman pride, Roman stubbornness, Roman refusal to accept defeat. And now he was preparing a battlefield where that pride would become Rome's tomb. The Roman Senate met in emergency session in the summer of 216 BC, and the mood was pure rage. Hannibal had been ravaging Italy for 2 years, and every attempt to stop him had ended in catastrophe. The senators made a decision that seemed unassailable: raise the largest army Rome had ever fielded and simply overwhelm the Carthaginians through sheer mass. They authorized 8 full legions, 80,000 men, backed by allied Italian troops that pushed the total force to nearly 87,000 soldiers. This wasn't an army. It was a human tidal wave designed to sweep Hannibal from existence. Command was split between 2 consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Varro was aggressive, ambitious, and convinced that Roman courage could beat any tactical cleverness. Paulus was cautious, experienced, and deeply worried about Hannibal's reputation for deception. The Senate backed Varro. They wanted blood, not caution. They wanted Hannibal's head on a spike in the forum. What they got instead was the worst day in Roman military history. Let those numbers sink in for a moment. 87,000 soldiers represented the largest military force Rome had ever assembled in its 500-year history. For context, the entire population of Rome at this time was roughly 400,000 people. The Senate had just committed 1/5 of their military-age male population to a single campaign. They stripped garrisons from cities across Italy. They called in every favor from allied states. They emptied the treasury to equip and supply this massive force. The logistics alone were staggering. Feeding 87,000 men required 20 tons of grain per day. The columns stretched for miles when marching. This was Rome betting everything on one roll of the dice, and they genuinely believed it was a sure thing. Here's where the internal conflict became critical. Roman tradition dictated that the 2 consuls would alternate command daily when leading armies together. One day Varro commanded, the next day Paulus commanded. It was a system designed to prevent military dictatorships, but it was catastrophic for battlefield coordination. Varro and Paulus couldn't have been more different. Varro came from a plebeian background. His family had made money as butchers and livestock traders. He'd risen through politics by appealing to the common people, promising aggressive action and quick victories. He viewed Hannibal as a foreign bandit who needed to be crushed through Roman strength and will. Tactics were for cowards. Real Romans just fought harder. Paulus was old patrician nobility. He'd commanded armies in Illyria. He'd fought in the Second Punic War's early campaigns. He knew what Hannibal was capable of, and it terrified him. Paulus argued repeatedly that they should wait, maneuver, cut Hannibal's supply lines, and avoid a direct engagement on ground of the Carthaginians' choosing. The Senate, dominated by Varro's populist faction, overruled Paulus repeatedly. They hadn't raised 87,000 men to sit in camp and play games of maneuver. By late July 216 BC, the massive Roman army began its march south toward Apulia, where scouts reported Hannibal had occupied the town of Cannae and seized a Roman supply depot. The consuls debated strategy during the entire march. Paulus urged caution. Varro demanded immediate attack. The troops, confident in their overwhelming numbers, sided with Varro. They wanted battle. They wanted glory. They wanted revenge for the humiliations at Trebia and Trasimene. What none of them understood was that Hannibal had been watching their approach for weeks. His scouts tracked every movement. He knew the size of their army, the route of their march, and most importantly, he knew about the conflict between Varro and Paulus. Hannibal had positioned himself at Cannae deliberately. The terrain was perfect, flat, open ground ideal for cavalry. And he'd calculated correctly that Varro's aggression would overcome Paulus's caution. As the Roman army approached Cannae on August 1st, 87,000 soldiers confident in their numerical superiority, they had no idea they were marching into the most perfectly designed killing field in military history. Hannibal had spent 2 years engineering this moment, and Rome, blinded by rage and confidence, was about to give him exactly what he wanted. One decisive battle where he could destroy them all at once. Hannibal knew exactly what Rome would do. They would raise a massive army, march south with overwhelming confidence, and try to crush him in a single, decisive battle. So he gave them exactly what they wanted, but on ground of his choosing. He positioned his 50,000 troops near the village of Cannae in southeastern Italy, deliberately setting up camp at a Roman supply depot. The location was perfect bait. If the Romans didn't attack, they'd lose critical supplies. If they did attack, they'd have to fight on a flat, open plain with no forests, no hills, no terrain features that could disrupt Hannibal's cavalry. The ground was hard-packed dirt, perfect for cavalry maneuvers and terrible for Roman infantry trying to break formation. Hannibal's scouts tracked the Roman advance every step of the way. When reports confirmed that Varro and Paulus were bringing the full 87,000-man army directly toward Cannae, Hannibal smiled. The Romans thought they were hunting him. They had no idea they were walking into history's most perfectly executed slaughter. The plain of Cannae stretched roughly 2 miles wide and 3 miles deep. A vast, featureless killing floor. No rivers to anchor flanks. No forests to hide reserves. No hills to provide defensive positions. For a Roman general accustomed to using terrain for advantage, it should have been a warning sign. For Hannibal, it was perfect. The Aufidus River ran along the northern edge, but far enough away that it wouldn't interfere with troop movements. The dusty ground, baked hard by the August sun, would support heavy cavalry charges without turning to mud. And most critically, the openness meant the Romans could deploy their entire 87,000-man army in a single, massive formation. They would see no reason not to. Here's what made Hannibal's choice of ground genuinely brilliant. He understood that Roman tactical doctrine relied on weight and mass. Roman legionaries fought in tight formation, shields locked, pushing forward like a human battering ram. The more men you could pack into that formation, the more unstoppable it became. Cannae's open terrain practically invited the Romans to deploy every single soldier they had in one overwhelming push. And Hannibal wanted them to do exactly that. But here's the detail that chronicles often miss. Hannibal's 50,000 troops weren't evenly distributed. He had roughly 40,000 infantry, Gallic warriors, Iberian swordsmen, and 10,000 elite African veterans who'd captured Roman equipment at previous battles. But his real advantage was cavalry. Hannibal commanded 10,000 horsemen. The Romans had only 6,000. Think about that ratio. In cavalry, Hannibal had nearly a 2.1 advantage despite being outnumbered overall. And on flat open ground, cavalry superiority was everything. Hannibal's cavalry commander was a Numidian prince named Hannibal, a tactical genius in his own right who commanded 4,000 light cavalry. Fast, mobile, perfect for harassment and pursuit. His heavy cavalry, 6,000 Spanish and Gallic horsemen in armor, would hit like a hammer. These weren't just mounted soldiers. They were the most experienced cavalry force in the ancient world, hardened by years of warfare in Spain and the Alpine crossing. They'd fought together, maneuvered together, and trusted their commanders completely. The Romans, by contrast, had pulled their cavalry from allied Italian cities. Some units had never trained together. Their commanders were political appointees, not professional cavalrymen. Quality versus quantity, and on a cavalry battlefield, quality would dominate. By August 1st, 216 BC, Hannibal's forces had been in position at Cannae for 3 days. His scouts reported the Roman army approaching from the north, their columns stretching for miles. Hannibal stood on a small rise overlooking the plain and watched the dust cloud grow closer. His officers gathered around him, nervous despite their previous victories. Hasdrubal, his brother and second in command, asked the question everyone was thinking. "They outnumber us nearly 2-1. Are you certain this will work?" Hannibal's response, recorded by the Greek historian Polybius, was chilling. "I am certain. They will deploy exactly as I need them to. They will attack exactly when I want them to. And by sunset tomorrow, Rome will have no army left." The Romans were marching toward their doom, and they were doing it with confidence. That confidence would last exactly one more day. Dawn broke hot and still over the plain of Cannae on August 216 BC. The Roman army assembled in their traditional formation, a massive rectangular block of infantry, 8 men deep and stretching nearly a mile wide. 80,000 soldiers packed so tightly that men in the rear ranks could barely see the enemy. It was a formation designed to generate unstoppable forward momentum. When that many men pushed forward in lockstep, nothing should be able to stand against them. The Roman cavalry, about 6,000 horsemen, positioned themselves on the flanks, 3,000 on each side. Across the field, Hannibal's 50,000 looked almost comical by comparison. His infantry numbered only 40,000, and they were arranged in a strange crescent formation, bowing outward toward the Romans. His cavalry, though, that was different. Hannibal had 10,000 horsemen, and he placed them on both flanks. The numerical disparity seemed laughable to the Romans. They had 80,000 men. Hannibal had 50,000. They had Rome's finest legionaries. Hannibal had a mix of Iberians, Gauls, and Africans. This should be a massacre, and it would be. Just not the massacre the Romans expected. The Roman formation was a geometric expression of their military philosophy. Overwhelming force applied at a single point. The legionaries stood shoulder to shoulder, each man occupying roughly 3 feet of frontage. Simple math. 80,000 men in an 8-deep formation created a line approximately 30,000 feet wide, nearly 6 miles. But Varro, commanding that day, had compressed the formation even tighter. He wanted maximum weight behind the initial push, so he narrowed the frontage to about a mile, which meant the formation wasn't 8 men deep. It was closer to 15 deep in some sections. Think about what that means. Soldiers in the back rows couldn't even see the enemy. They would spend the entire battle pushing the men in front of them forward, blind to everything except the backs of their comrades. Here's where Hannibal's formation becomes fascinating. His infantry line was roughly 8,000 feet wide, about 1.5 miles, deliberately matching the Roman frontage. But instead of standing in a straight line, his troops formed a crescent that bulged forward toward the Romans. The weakest troops, 20,000 Gallic and Iberian infantry, stood in the center of that crescent, the most exposed position. These weren't professional soldiers. They were tribal warriors, fierce but undisciplined, armed with long swords and minimal armor. Hannibal placed them exactly where the Roman juggernaut would hit first. On the flanks of that crescent, angled slightly inward and back, stood Hannibal's elite troops. 10,000 African veterans, many wearing captured Roman armor and carrying Roman shields. They stood in deeper formations, tighter discipline, waiting in positions that looked almost defensive. To the Romans, it appeared Hannibal's flanks were refusing engagement, holding back. It was camouflage. Those African veterans were the jaws of the trap, waiting to close. But here's what should have terrified Roman commanders if they'd been paying attention: Hannibal's cavalry deployment. On the Roman right flank, Hasdrubal commanded 6,000 Spanish and Gallic heavy cavalry, armored horsemen built for shock combat. They outnumbered the Roman cavalry, facing them 2 to 1. On the Roman left flank, Maharbal commanded 4,000 Numidian light cavalry, fast, mobile, expert skirmishers. The Romans had positioned their allied cavalry there, 3,000 men who'd barely trained, together. Varro, watching from horseback behind the Roman lines, saw the numbers he wanted to see: 80,000 against 50,000. Paulus, commanding the Roman right-wing cavalry, saw something different. He saw Hannibal's horsemen outnumbering his own. He saw that strange crescent formation that made no tactical sense. He saw Carthaginian confidence that shouldn't exist for an outnumbered force. He rode to Varro and reportedly said, "Something is wrong. This formation, it's a trap." Varro's response, recorded by Roman historian Livy: "The only trap is thinking too much. We have 80,000 men. They have 50,000. We attack now." At approximately 10 a.m., with the sun already beating down mercilessly, Varro gave the order. Trumpets blared across the Roman lines. 80,000 men began to march forward, their sandals raising clouds of dust that turned the morning air hazy. The ground trembled. The noise was deafening. Thousands of men moving in unison, armor clanking, officers shouting commands, the rhythmic thud of feet hitting packed earth. Across the field, Hannibal stood motionless, watching Rome's might advance toward him. He didn't flinch. He didn't issue orders. He simply waited for the Romans to close the distance and seal their doom. In approximately 6 hours, 50,000 Roman soldiers would be dead. The perfect battle was about to begin. Here's where Hannibal revealed genius that military academies still study. His infantry formation wasn't random. It was a carefully engineered trap. The center of his line bulged outward in a crescent shape, made up of his weakest troops, Gallic and Iberian infantry. These men were positioned to do one job: give ground slowly. Behind them, hidden in the standard formation, were Hannibal's best troops, African veterans in captured Roman armor. They were positioned on the flanks of the infantry line, angled slightly inward. The formation looked like a bow drawn backward, ready to spring. When the Romans charged, they would hit the weak center first. That center would slowly retreat, drawing the Romans deeper into the formation. Meanwhile, the African veterans on the flanks would hold firm. As the Romans pushed forward, they would naturally compress inward, packing tighter and tighter, losing their maneuverability. And then Hannibal's cavalry would strike the flanks and rear. The Romans would be surrounded, compressed, and slaughtered without ever breaking through. It was brilliant. It was mathematically perfect. And the Romans walked right into it. Let's break down exactly how precise this formation was. The crescent's deepest point, the center bulge, extended approximately 300 yards forward from the flanks. The Gallic and Iberian troops standing there were arranged only 4 ranks deep. Think about that. 4 men deep facing a Roman formation, 15 men deep. The math was deliberately suicidal for the center. Hannibal needed them to lose, but they couldn't collapse instantly. They had to retreat at exactly the right pace, roughly 10 yards every 5 minutes. Too fast, and the Romans wouldn't follow deeply enough. Too slow, and the center would shatter completely, and the Romans would break through. The African veterans on the flanks were the opposite. 8 to 10 ranks deep, packed in dense, disciplined formations. These 10,000 men wore captured Roman chainmail, carried Roman shields, and fought with Roman gladi, short swords designed for stabbing in tight formation. From a distance, they looked like Roman reinforcements. They were positioned at 45-degree angles, facing slightly inward toward where the battle would develop. When the time came, they would wheel inward and attack the sides of the Roman formation like closing doors. Here's what military historians find genuinely remarkable. Hannibal's formation required 4 different ethnic groups: Gauls, Iberians, Africans, and Numidians, who spoke different languages and followed different combat traditions to execute a coordinated maneuver with perfect timing. One mistake, one unit panicking or holding too long, and the entire trap collapses. The odds of pulling this off were astronomically low. But Hannibal had one advantage the Romans didn't. His army had been together for 3 years. They'd crossed the Alps together. They'd fought at Trebia and Trasimene together. They trusted him absolutely. When Hannibal told the Gallic warriors in the center, "You will take the first impact, you will suffer the worst casualties, and you must hold long enough for the trap to close," they believed him. They knew he'd earned the right to ask for their sacrifice. The Roman commanders saw none of this complexity. Varro saw a forward bulging line that looked like overconfidence. The crescent appeared to him like Hannibal was pushing his center forward aggressively, a sign of poor discipline or desperation. Roman tactical doctrine taught that you put your best troops in the center, where the decisive action happened. Hannibal had apparently put his weakest troops there. To Varro, it looked like incompetence. Paulus saw something different. The formation's geometry bothered him. Why would Hannibal extend his center forward when he was already outnumbered? Why position it to take the first, most devastating impact? It made no sense unless the center was meant to break, unless retreat was the plan. But before Paulus could voice his concerns again, the Roman advance reached contact range. At 10:30 a.m., the first Roman ranks crashed into the Gallic center. Shields slammed together, swords thrust, men screamed. The Gauls fought desperately, knowing they were facing 4-to-1 odds in their sector. Blood soaked the dust within seconds. And exactly as Hannibal had planned, the center began, very slowly, very deliberately, to give ground. The Romans pushed harder, sensing victory. The crescent was bending inward. The trap was closing its mouth. And 80,000 Romans had no idea they were about to be swallowed whole. Consul Varro commanded the Roman forces that morning, and he saw exactly what he wanted to see. A numerically inferior enemy arrayed on open ground with a weak center that looked ready to collapse. Paulus, the co-consul, urged caution. Something about Hannibal's formation felt wrong. The Carthaginian was too calm, too confident. But Varro overruled him. They had 80,000 men. Hannibal had 50,000. The math was simple. They would march forward, hit the center with overwhelming force, break through, and roll up the Carthaginian flanks. It was textbook Roman tactics. Apply superior numbers at the decisive point and crush through sheer mass. Varro gave the order. The entire Roman line, 80,000 men, began to advance. The ground shook. The noise was deafening. Thousands of sandaled feet hitting packed earth in rhythmic unison, the rattle of armor, the war cries of men who believed victory was inevitable. Across the field, Hannibal watched them come. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply waited for the Romans to close the distance and seal their fate. Gaius Terentius Varro's confidence wasn't just arrogance. It was backed by what seemed like irrefutable logic. He'd reviewed the casualty reports from Trebia and Trasimene. Yes, Rome had lost. But those defeats happened because Hannibal used terrain. Narrow valleys, fog, ambush positions. At Trebia, the Romans fought in freezing water while exhausted. At Trasimene, they were strung out on a road, unable to deploy properly. Those weren't fair fights. This was different. Open ground, clear visibility, full deployment, perfect conditions for Roman legionary tactics. And the numbers were overwhelming. 80,000 against 50,000 meant that even if the Carthaginians fought with supernatural skill, the Romans could afford to trade 2 casualties for everyone they inflicted and still win. But here's what Varro missed. Hannibal had never fought a fair fight in his entire career. He had won every battle by creating unfair conditions through superior positioning and maneuver. The fact that he was willing to stand and fight on open ground should have been the ultimate warning sign. Hannibal didn't make mistakes. Paulus understood this. At 9:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the advance began, Paulus rode to Varro and delivered one final warning. Historical accounts record the exchange. Paulus, look at his cavalry. He outnumbers us on both flanks. If he breaks our horse and wheels around, we'll be fighting on 3 sides. Varro's response dripped with contempt. Then our infantry will fight on 3 sides and win on all 3. Stop seeing ghosts. This is simple mathematics. Think about that exchange for a moment. One consul saw the trap. One consul saw only opportunity. And Roman tradition dictated that command alternated daily between them. August 2nd was Varro's day. His decision was final. At 10 Alvord a.m., Varro gave the command that would kill 50,000 Romans. The trumpets blared. The entire formation surged. Forward. The legionaries in the front ranks moved first. Shields raised, short swords ready. The ranks behind pushed against their backs, adding weight and momentum. Within seconds, the entire mass was moving. 80,000 men covering roughly 2,500 yards of frontage, advancing in disciplined lines toward Hannibal's crescent. The dust rose so thick it created an artificial fog. Officers shouted cadence to keep the line straight. Centurions barked orders to maintain formation. The noise was primal. Thousands of men rhythmically shouting, "Roma, Roma, Roma," as they marched, stamping the ground in unison. The psychological effect was designed to be overwhelming. Roman infantry advancing in full formation had broken armies before contact. The sight and sound alone had caused enemies to flee. Hannibal's troops didn't flee. They stood motionless, waiting. The Gallic warriors in the center gripped their long swords tighter. The African veterans on the flanks checked their shields one last time. The cavalry on both wings tightened their formations, horses stamping nervously. Hannibal stood at the rear of his formation on a small rise that gave him visibility across the entire battlefield. His officers surrounded him, watching the Roman advance with visible tension. One asked, "Should we move forward to meet them?" Hannibal shook his head. "Let them come to us. Let them commit. Let them believe they're winning." At 10:20 a.m., the Romans closed to within 100 yards. Varro, watching from horseback, felt victory rushing toward him like a physical force. The enemy center looked thin, vulnerable, ready to break. In his mind, he was already composing the speech he would give in the Senate, already imagining his triumph through Rome's streets. Paulus, commanding the Roman right cavalry wing, watched Hannibal's heavy cavalry across from him and felt dread settle into his bones like winter cold. Something terrible was about to happen. He just didn't know what. 10 minutes later, he would find out, and it would be too late to stop. The Roman front ranks crashed into Hannibal's center like a human avalanche. 40,000 legionaries, packed 8 deep, pushed forward with overwhelming force. The Gallic and Iberian troops in Hannibal's center fought hard, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. Slowly, deliberately, they began to give ground. The crescent started to bend inward. The Romans saw it happening and surged forward, convinced they were winning. Varro, watching from horseback, felt vindication flood through him. The enemy center was breaking. Victory was minutes away. But here's what the Romans didn't notice. The center was giving ground, but it wasn't collapsing. The retreat was controlled, organized, deliberate. And as the Romans pushed deeper into the crescent, their formation began to compress. Men who'd started the battle with room to swing a sword now found themselves pressed shoulder to shoulder with the soldiers beside them. The Roman line, once a mile wide, was now bunching inward, funneling into the narrowing gap as Hannibal's center retreated. The African veterans on Hannibal's flanks hadn't moved. They stood firm, watching the Romans pour into the center like water flowing into a narrowing channel. And on both wings, Hannibal's cavalry prepared to move. 10:30 a.m. The moment of contact was brutal and immediate. Roman gladi, short, stabbing swords designed for close quarters killing, thrust into Gallic shields and bodies. The Gauls fought back with their long, slashing swords, needing room to swing effectively. But there was no room. The Roman formation was too tight, too heavy, pushing forward with the weight of 40,000 men behind it. Gauls in the front ranks died within seconds, cut down by multiple sword thrusts from Romans fighting in coordinated pairs. Bodies fell. The men behind stepped over them and continued fighting. This was legionary doctrine at its most efficient. Don't break formation, don't chase glory, just kill the man in front of you and push forward. The Gallic casualties were staggering. In the first 10 minutes of contact, roughly 1,000 Gallic warriors fell, 100 men per minute dying in a space barely 400 yards wide. But here's what made Hannibal's plan work. The Gauls didn't break and run. Their chieftains had positioned themselves in the front ranks, fighting and dying alongside their warriors. That kind of leadership held the line together when every instinct screamed to flee. The Gauls gave ground, but they gave it in steps, not in panic. By 10:45 a.m., the crescent that had bulged 300 yards forward was now only 200 yards forward. The Romans had advanced approximately 100 yards in 15 minutes. To Varro, this felt like unstoppable momentum. To Hannibal, it was exactly the right pace. The trap was closing on schedule. Here's where the geometry becomes critical. As the Romans pushed forward into the retreating center, the natural instinct of soldiers on the edges of the formation was to angle inward toward where the fighting was heaviest. The Roman formation, which had started at roughly 5,000 feet wide, was now compressing to 4,000 feet. Think about what that means. 80,000 men who'd started with approximately 0.75 square yards per soldier now had roughly 0.6 square yards. Shields were touching. Men couldn't turn their bodies. Raising a sword above shoulder height became difficult, and the Romans kept pushing forward, driven by the weight of ranks behind them and the belief that victory was just ahead. Officers shouted encouragement. "They're breaking! Push harder!" Centurions in the rear ranks literally shoved their men forward, maintaining momentum. The dust was so thick now that visibility dropped to just a few yards. Men fought and died in a brown haze, unable to see the larger battlefield. What the Romans couldn't see was the African veterans on both flanks, still standing motionless in their 8-rank deep formations. These 10,000 elite soldiers hadn't taken a single casualty yet. They watched the Roman formation compress and flow past their positions, like watching a river narrow as it enters a gorge. Hannibal had positioned them at 45-degree angles for exactly this reason. As the Romans pushed deeper into the center, they were actually moving past the African flanks, exposing their sides. At 11 hours a.m., 30 minutes into the battle, the situation looked like this. The Gallic center had retreated 150 yards and lost roughly 2,000 men, a 10% casualty rate. The Roman front ranks had lost perhaps 500 men, mostly to Gallic desperation strikes. But the Roman formation was now compressed into a space 3,500 feet wide and extending 200 yards deep into Hannibal's position. From above, it would have looked like a giant fist punching into a yielding bag, the sides of the fist exposed and vulnerable. Varro saw the Gallic retreat accelerating slightly and shouted orders. "Double time! Break them now!" The Roman advance sped up. Men pushed harder. The formation compressed even further. They were now less than 100 yards from breaking completely through Hannibal's center. Victory seemed seconds away. Hannibal, watching from his command position, raised his right hand. It was the signal his cavalry commanders had been waiting for. On both flanks, 10,000 horsemen prepared to charge. The jaws of the trap were about to close, and 80,000 Romans, their attention fixed entirely on the retreating Gauls in front of them, had no idea what was coming from the sides. While the infantry ground against each other in the center, the real battle was about to be decided on the flanks. Hannibal's cavalry, 10,000 experienced horsemen, charged the Roman cavalry wings simultaneously. The Roman cavalry numbered only 6,000, and they were positioned too far from the infantry to receive support. What happened next was a slaughter. Hannibal's Numidian cavalry on the right flank and his heavy Spanish and Gallic cavalry on the left flank hit the Roman horsemen with coordinated precision. The Romans, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, broke almost immediately. Horses screamed, men fell. Within 30 minutes, both Roman cavalry wings had been completely routed. But here's where Hannibal's tactical genius became terrifying. Instead of pursuing the fleeing Roman cavalry off the battlefield, Hannibal's horsemen wheeled around behind the Roman infantry. They positioned themselves at the rear of the Roman formation, blocking any retreat. The Romans were still pushing forward into Hannibal's center, still convinced they were winning. They had no idea that the trap had just closed behind them. 11:05 a.m. Hasdrubal, commanding 6,000 Spanish and Gallic heavy cavalry on Hannibal's left wing, gave the order to charge. His horsemen thundered forward in a coordinated wedge formation, lances leveled, horses at full gallop. They hit the Roman right cavalry wing like a battering ram striking rotten wood. The Romans, commanded by Consul Paulus himself, numbered only 2,400 horsemen. The math was brutal. 2.5 to 1 odds against them. Worse, most of these Roman cavalry were Italian allies who'd been equipped with Roman gear, but had minimal training in coordinated cavalry tactics. The impact was catastrophic. Hasdrubal's veterans crashed into the Roman formation and simply rolled through it. Lances punched through shields and bodies. Horses collided at full speed, throwing riders and breaking legs. Within 5 minutes, the Roman right cavalry wing ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. Hundreds of riders died in the initial collision. Hundreds more were thrown from their mounts and trampled. The survivors broke and fled north toward the village of Cannae, pursued briefly by a small Carthaginian detachment. Here's what made this cavalry action decisive. Consul Paulus, the cautious one who'd warned about the trap, fell during this charge. Multiple sources suggest he was wounded by javelin throws, unhorsed, and then killed fighting on foot as Carthaginian cavalry surrounded him. The co-commander of Rome's entire army died 11 minutes into the battle. And because the cavalry action happened 600 yards away from the main infantry formation, most Romans had no idea their consul was dead. 11:15 a.m. On the opposite flank, Hannibal commanded 4,000 Numidian light cavalry facing 3,600 Roman allied cavalry. This action was different. Not a crushing charge, but a swirling melee. The Numidians were expert skirmishers, armed with javelins and small shields, mounted on fast horses bred for endurance and agility. They rode circles around the heavier Roman cavalry, throwing javelins from 30 yards out, retreating when the Romans tried to charge, then wheeling back to throw again. The Roman allied cavalry, frustrated and taking casualties without being able to strike back, eventually broke formation and scattered. By 11:30 a.m., both Roman cavalry wings had been destroyed or routed. Total time elapsed, 25 minutes. Roman cavalry casualties, approximately 2,000 killed, when 500 fled, 300 combat ineffective. Carthaginian casualties, fewer than 400. Think about those numbers for a second. In 25 minutes, Hannibal's cavalry had eliminated Rome's entire mounted force while losing less than 4% of their own strength. The kill ratio was 5-1. But here's where standard ancient warfare doctrine would have led to a different outcome. Pursuing fleeing cavalry was normal. You chase them off the battlefield, scatter them completely, claim victory in your sector, then maybe, hours later, return to support the infantry. Hasdrubal didn't pursue. This was the decision that won the battle. Instead of chasing scattered Roman horsemen across the countryside, Hasdrubal immediately reformed his 6,000 heavy cavalry and began a controlled wheel around the rear of the Roman infantry formation. Hannibal, on the opposite flank, did the same with his 4,000 Numidians. The two cavalry forces, operating from opposite sides of the battlefield without direct communication, executed a coordinated maneuver with perfect timing. By 11:45 a.m., Carthaginian cavalry was positioned behind the Roman infantry. 10,000 horsemen forming a wall 2,000 yards wide, blocking any possibility of retreat. The Romans, still focused entirely on pushing through Hannibal's infantry center, hadn't noticed. Their officers were shouting encouragement about the breakthrough that seemed imminent. Their legionaries were packed so tightly they could barely see beyond the men in front of them. The dust and chaos made situational awareness impossible. Hannibal watched his cavalry complete their maneuver and smiled. The Romans were now surrounded on 3 sides: front, left and right, with cavalry blocking the rear. 80,000 men trapped in a closing vise, and they still thought they were winning. In the next 15 minutes, that illusion would shatter completely. By midday, the Roman army found itself in a position no military force ever wants to be in, completely surrounded. The center was still pushing forward against Hannibal's retreating Gauls and Iberians, but now the formation had compressed into a dense, immobile mass. Men couldn't lift their weapons. Shields pressed against shields. And then Hannibal gave the signal. The African veterans on both flanks, who had stood motionless during the entire first phase of the battle, turned inward. They crashed into the sides of the Roman formation with devastating force. At the same moment, Hannibal's cavalry charged the rear. The Romans were now boxed in on all four sides, front, flanks, and rear. This was the double envelopment, the tactical maneuver that would be studied and copied for the next 2,200 years. The Romans had 80,000 men on the field, but because of the compression and encirclement, only the men on the outside edge could actually fight. The vast majority, tens of thousands of soldiers, were trapped in the middle, unable to move, unable to defend themselves, waiting to die. 12 p.m., noon. The sun directly overhead, heat shimmering off the dusty plain. Hannibal raised both arms, the signal his African commanders had been waiting 90 minutes to see. On both flanks simultaneously, 10,000 African veterans executed a wheeling maneuver with parade ground precision. The units on the far left pivoted 90 degrees to the right. The units on the far right pivoted 90 degrees to the left. Within 2 minutes, formations that had been facing outward were now facing inward, positioned perpendicular to the Roman flanks. And then they charged. The impact was devastating because it was completely unexpected. Roman soldiers on the edges of the formation were facing forward, watching their comrades push into the Gallic center, when suddenly attacks came from their sides. African veterans in captured Roman armor, looking almost like friendly reinforcements, crashed into the Roman flanks with coordinated fury. Gladies stabbed between shields. Men fell screaming, clutching wounds they never saw coming. Within 5 minutes, the Romans on both edges were fighting desperately on two fronts: the retreating Gauls ahead and the African veterans beside them. Here's where the mathematics became truly horrific. The Roman formation was now compressed into a rough rectangle approximately 2,800 feet wide and 400 feet deep. Simple geometry. That's 120,000 square feet of space containing 80,000 men. That gives each soldier exactly 14 square feet, a space roughly 3.7 feet by 3.7 feet. Think about that. Stand up right now and measure out a space less than 4 feet on each side. That's how much room a Roman legionary had at Cannae. You can't swing a sword in that space. You can barely turn your body. Raising your shield arm becomes difficult because you hit the man beside you. And now attacks were coming from 3 directions simultaneously. Hannibal's cavalry, 10,000 horsemen, charged into the rear of the Roman formation at 12:05 p.m. They didn't attempt to break through. Cavalry couldn't break formed infantry from the rear. Instead, they formed a wall of horses and spears, blocking any possibility of retreat while throwing javelins into the packed Roman ranks. Men in the rear of the formation, who'd spent the entire battle pushing their comrades forward, suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against cavalry attacks they couldn't effectively counter. The Roman formation was now a box, 2,800 feet wide, 400 feet deep, completely surrounded. The perimeter of that box measured roughly 6,400 feet, just over a mile. Carthaginian forces, infantry and cavalry combined, surrounded that entire perimeter. Now do this calculation. 50,000 Carthaginian troops spread across 6,400 feet gives approximately 8 Carthaginians per yard of perimeter. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming an unbroken wall of spears, swords, and shields, completely enclosing 80,000 Romans. But here's what made the situation tactically impossible for Rome. Only Roman soldiers at the perimeter could actually fight. Soldiers in the interior, roughly 50,000 men, could do nothing but wait. They couldn't see what was happening. They couldn't move forward to reinforce weak points. They couldn't retreat because there was nowhere to go. They simply stood, packed against their comrades, listening to the sounds of battle draw closer as the perimeter collapsed inward. Varro, somewhere in the middle of that compressed mass, finally understood what had happened. The battle he thought Rome was winning had been lost before it began. The trap had closed perfectly. The formation that was supposed to generate unstoppable momentum had become a prison. Every tactical advantage Rome possessed, numbers, equipment, training, had been neutralized by geometry and maneuver. His 80,000 men were now a mob, not an army. At 12:15 p.m., Hannibal gave his final order: contract the perimeter. Slowly, methodically, tighten the noose. The Carthaginian forces began, advancing inward from all sides. The space containing 80,000 Romans began to shrink. And the killing, which had been intense, transformed into something history had never witnessed before. Systematic, mechanical slaughter on an industrial scale. The next 5 hours would produce 50,000 corpses. What happened over the next 6 hours wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The Romans, compressed into an immobile mass, couldn't fight back effectively. Men at the edges of the formation tried to turn and face the attacks coming from all directions, but there was no room to maneuver. The Carthaginian infantry and cavalry moved around the Roman formation like butchers, stabbing and cutting methodically. There was no glory in it, no dramatic sword fights, just systematic killing. Roman soldiers in the center of the formation couldn't even see what was happening. They stood pressed against their comrades, hearing the screams, feeling the blood of men in front of them splatter backward, waiting for the killing to reach them. Some men suffocated, crushed by the press of bodies. Others were killed where they stood, unable to raise their weapons. The few who tried to break out and run were cut down by cavalry. Consul Paulus, who had warned against this battle, fought until he was cut down at the edge of the formation. Varro, who had pushed for the attack, fled the field with 70 surviving cavalry. By late afternoon, the dust and heat had turned the plain into a vision of hell. 80,000 men had marched onto that field. Fewer than 15,000 would leave it alive. 12:30 p.m. The temperature on the plain reached approximately 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Men in armor, packed body to body, were already suffering from heat exhaustion before the real killing began. The Carthaginian forces began their systematic contraction of the perimeter. African veterans on the flanks advanced inward step by step, stabbing with gladi into the compressed Roman mass. Each thrust found flesh. There was no room to dodge, no space to raise shields effectively. Men in the front ranks of the Roman formation fought desperately, but they were fighting from positions of complete tactical disadvantage. Unable to maneuver, unable to coordinate, simply trying to survive the next sword thrust. Here's what made the slaughter so efficient. The Carthaginians weren't fighting individual duels. They were working in coordinated units, relieving tired men with fresh troops every 15 minutes. The Romans had no such rotation. Men who'd marched miles that morning, then fought for 2 hours in the center, now stood trapped with no water, no rest, no relief. Exhaustion became a weapon as deadly as any sword. 1:00 p.m. The Roman perimeter had contracted from 6,400 feet to approximately 5,500 feet. The internal space had shrunk to roughly 850,000 square feet, containing 70,000 men. 10,000 were already dead. Each soldier now had approximately 12 square feet of space. The bodies of the dead couldn't fall. They remained upright, held in place by the press of living men around them. Romans in the interior ranks stood shoulder to shoulder with corpses, feeling them cool and stiffen. 2:00 p.m. The mathematics of the killing became genuinely horrific. By this point, roughly 20,000 Romans had died, 10,000 deaths per hour, or 166 deaths per minute. Think about that rate. Nearly 3 Romans dying every single second for 2 straight hours. The Carthaginian soldiers weren't even exerting themselves. They simply stood at the perimeter, thrust their weapons into the mass of humanity in front of them, withdrew, thrust again. The work was mechanical, exhausting in its repetition rather than its intensity. But here's what the chronicles rarely emphasize. Many Romans didn't die from wounds. They died from suffocation and heat stroke. Men in the center of the formation, unable to move their arms or expand their chests fully, struggled to breathe in air thick with dust and the metallic smell of blood. The heat was crushing. Men passed out standing up. Others went mad from thirst and terror, screaming until their voices gave out. 3:30 p.m. Varro made his escape. Surrounded by approximately 70 cavalry who'd managed to stay mounted and together, he fought his way through the Carthaginian cavalry cordon on the northern edge of the battlefield. The Numidians, focused on containing the infantry mass, let the small cavalry group break through rather than diverting forces to pursue them. Varro rode north toward Venusia, leaving 65,000 Romans still trapped on the killing floor. His survival would haunt him for the rest of his life. But in that moment, it was simple battlefield calculation. The battle was lost. Staying meant death. Escaping meant he could at least report what had happened. 4:00 p.m. The Roman formation had collapsed to approximately 4,000 feet of perimeter, containing 40,000 survivors. The ground was carpeted with bodies, stacked in places 2 and 3 deep. Blood had turned the dust into a slick mud that made footing treacherous. Carthaginian soldiers, rotating through the killing line, now had to climb over Roman corpses to reach the living. The smell was overwhelming. Blood, excrement, vomit, death. Men vomited from the stench and kept fighting. 5:00 p.m. Approximately 25,000 Romans still lived, compressed into a space barely 1,000 feet across. Some had stopped fighting entirely, simply standing with weapons lowered, waiting for death. Others fought with the desperate energy of men who knew they were doomed but refused to die passively. Centurions, identifiable by their transverse crests, were specifically targeted by Carthaginian soldiers. Kill the leaders, and resistance collapsed. By this point, most Roman officers were dead. 6:00 p.m. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across a field transformed into an abattoir. Roughly 10,000 Romans remained, formed into a final tight cluster, still trying to maintain some semblance of formation. These were the hardest, most experienced soldiers, men who'd survived 6 hours of hell through skill, luck, and sheer will. Hannibal reportedly offered them surrender terms. Most refused. The killing continued into twilight. By 7:00 p.m., organized resistance had ended. Carthaginian soldiers moved through the battlefield in the gathering darkness, finishing wounded Romans and counting the dead. The numbers defied belief. 50,000 to 70,000 Romans killed, depending on which ancient source you trust. The plain of Cannae had become Rome's graveyard. When the killing finally stopped at sunset, the Carthaginian soldiers walked among the dead and made an attempt to count the bodies. Roman sources, written decades later with bitter precision, recorded the losses. 50,000 Roman soldiers dead, another 10,000 captured. Among the dead were 80 senators, 29 military tribunes, and Consul Paulus himself. The bodies lay so thick on the ground that in places they were stacked 3 and 4 deep. Blood had turned the dust into mud. The smell of death was so overwhelming that Carthaginian soldiers had to work in shifts to strip armor from the corpses. Hannibal's losses? Approximately 6,000 men, mostly the Gauls who had held the center during the initial Roman push. The mathematical reality was almost incomprehensible. In a single afternoon, a smaller army had killed more than 50,000 enemy soldiers while losing fewer than 6,000 of their own. The kill ratio was 8.1. No battle before or since has achieved that level of lopsided slaughter at such scale. Roman historians later wrote that the river Aufidus, which ran near the battlefield, reportedly ran red with blood for 3 days. Modern historians debate whether that was literally true or poetic exaggeration. Either way, it captured the scale of the massacre. August 2nd, 7:30 p.m. Twilight descended on the plain of Cannae, and Carthaginian officers began the grim task of organizing the aftermath. The battlefield covered roughly 2 square miles, approximately 1,180 acres. Spread across that space lay between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman dead, depending on which ancient source you trust. Even using the conservative estimate of 50,000, that's 39 bodies per acre. Walk 50 feet in any direction, and you'd step over a corpse. The logistics of death on this scale were staggering. Stripping armor and weapons from 50,000 bodies would take days, even with thousands of men working. Here's where the numbers become genuinely horrifying when you break them down by category. Among the Roman dead, 80 senators, men who'd served in Rome's highest legislative body, representing roughly 27% of the entire Senate. 29 military tribunes, senior officers, each commanding roughly 600 men. 48 quaestors and junior magistrates. The Roman officer corps had been effectively decapitated. These weren't just soldiers. They were Rome's political and military leadership class, wiped out in a single afternoon. The consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus was found among the dead on the right flank, his body bearing multiple wounds. Historical accounts suggest he'd fought on foot after his horse was killed, refusing to flee when escape was still possible. His body was identified by his distinctive consular armor and was treated with respect by Carthaginian soldiers who understood they'd killed a man of genuine courage. The irony was bitter. Paulus, who'd warned against fighting at Cannae, had died fighting the battle Varro had forced. But here's what made Cannae uniquely devastating beyond just the casualty count: the age and quality of the dead. These weren't raw recruits or hastily raised militia. These were 8 full legions, Rome's best soldiers, men with years of training and combat experience. Each legion represented an investment of thousands of hours of drill, discipline, and tactical education. Rome had just lost approximately 60% of its trained military manpower in 6 hours. Replacing the bodies would take months. Replacing the experience would take years. Think about the economic cost. A fully equipped Roman legionary's gear, armor, shield, gladius, pilum, helmet, cost roughly 1,200 denarii, equivalent to about 3 years of a common laborer's wages. Multiply that by 50,000 soldiers, and Rome had just lost equipment worth 60 million denarii, roughly 5% of the Republic's entire annual revenue. And that's just the equipment. The human capital, trained soldiers in their prime fighting years, was irreplaceable. Hannibal walked the battlefield that evening, accompanied by his brother Hasdrubal and cavalry commander Maharbal. They surveyed the carnage in silence. Ancient sources suggest that even Hannibal, who'd planned this massacre down to the smallest detail, was sobered by the scale of what he'd achieved. One of his officers reportedly commented that surely now Rome would surrender. Hannibal's response, recorded by the historian Polybius, was prophetic. Rome doesn't know how to surrender. We've won the battle, but the war has just become more difficult. By midnight, Carthaginian soldiers had collected approximately 80,000 pounds of gold and silver rings taken from the fingers of dead Roman officers and senators. The rings were sent to Carthage as proof of victory. When they were poured onto the floor of the Carthaginian Senate, the pile stood 3 feet high. It was physical evidence of Rome's worst military disaster. But Rome was still standing, and Hannibal was about to make the decision that would define the rest of the war, whether to march on Rome itself or consolidate his victory. That choice would haunt military historians for 2,200 years. Consul Varro survived Cannae, and that survival became his burden. He escaped with approximately 70 cavalry when the battle became clearly unwinnable, riding north in a desperate dash toward the city of Venusia. Roman tradition dictated that commanders who lost battles should fall on their swords rather than survive the shame. Varro lived, and he would spend the rest of his life defending that choice. When he arrived in Rome and reported the disaster, the Senate was struck silent. Some senators wept openly, others called for Varro's execution. But here's what's remarkable. The Senate ultimately thanked Varro for not despairing of the Republic. They understood that Rome needed scapegoats, but they also needed survivors who could testify to what had happened and ensure the lessons were learned. Varro would never command troops again, but Rome let him live. The message was clear. Losing was forgivable. Not learning from the loss was not. And Rome had just learned the hardest lesson in its history. Numerical superiority means nothing without tactical intelligence. Hannibal had taught them that with 50,000 corpses. August 2nd, 3:30 p.m. Varro makes the decision that will define his life. From his position near the rear of the collapsing Roman formation, he can see that the battle is lost beyond recovery. The perimeter is contracting. Men are dying by the hundreds every minute. Staying means death. He gathers the roughly 70 mounted cavalry still with him. Officers, tribunes, a handful of allied horsemen who've managed to keep their horses alive, and orders a breakout attempt through the northern edge of the Carthaginian cavalry cordon. The Numidians, focused on containing the infantry mass, let them through. It's a calculated decision by the Carthaginian commanders. 70 fleeing cavalry posed no threat, and pursuing them would weaken the encirclement. Varro and his survivors galloped north, leaving 65,000 Romans behind to die. Think about those numbers. Out of 87,000 men who marched onto the field that morning, 70 escaped with Varro. That's a survival rate of 0.08%, not even 1/10 of 1%. Varro commanded the largest army Rome had ever assembled, and he escaped with fewer men than a single century, the smallest unit in a legion. The ride to Venusia covered approximately 30 miles of rough terrain. Varro and his cavalry reached the town by nightfall, exhausted, traumatized, covered in dust and blood. The garrison commander at Venusia didn't believe the initial reports. How could 87,000 Romans be destroyed in a single day? But the evidence stood before him. A consul, covered in the grime of battle, accompanied by 70 shell-shocked survivors, reporting that Rome's army no longer existed. Varro spent the night writing his report to the Senate. Ancient sources suggest he wrote and rewrote it multiple times, trying to find words adequate to describe what had happened. How do you tell Rome that you've just lost an entire army? How do you explain that Hannibal had anticipated every move, exploited every weakness, turned Rome's strength into its death trap? The final dispatch, sent by fast courier the next morning, was brutally direct. We have been defeated in a great battle. The army is destroyed. Consul Paulus is dead. I am withdrawing the survivors to Venusia. August 5th, 216 BC. 3 days after Cannae, Varro's dispatch reached Rome. The Senate was in session when the courier arrived. The man who read the message aloud reportedly broke down halfway through. Silence fell over the chamber. Then chaos. Some senators demanded immediate evacuation of the city. Surely Hannibal would march on Rome. Others called for Varro's arrest and execution for cowardice. A few, the eldest and most experienced, simply sat in stunned silence, understanding that Rome had just experienced an existential catastrophe. Here's what made the Senate's response remarkable. Instead of scapegoating Varro entirely, they voted to thank him for not despairing of the Republic, for surviving when he could have died, for reporting the truth when he could have fled to exile, for maintaining some fragment of military cohesion when complete collapse was possible. The vote passed by a narrow margin, 167 senators in favor, 143 opposed. Rome was divided on whether survival without victory was honorable, but the pragmatists won. But make no mistake, Varro's political career was over. He would never command troops again. He would never hold high office again. He lived under a cloud of shame that never lifted. Roman mothers would tell their children, "Don't be like Varro," meaning don't survive your comrades in defeat. The phrase became cultural shorthand for cowardice, masquerading as pragmatism. Yet Varro's survival served a purpose. He testified before the Senate about Hannibal's tactics, about the double envelopment, about how the Carthaginian cavalry had been the decisive factor. He explained, in painful detail, how numerical superiority had been neutralized through superior positioning and maneuver. Those lessons would shape Roman military doctrine for the next decade. Rome would never again face Hannibal in a pitched battle using their traditional massed formation. They would adopt a strategy of attrition, harassment, and avoidance. Tactics designed to negate Hannibal's tactical genius. The question now was simple and terrifying. Would Hannibal march on Rome? The city was 250 miles away, its defenses weakened, its field army destroyed. Logic said Rome should prepare for siege or surrender, but Rome didn't do logic. Rome did defiance, and the Republic was about to prove that losing the perfect battle didn't mean losing the war. News of Cannae reached Rome within days, and the city prepared for the end. Hannibal was 250 miles away. His army was intact. Rome's main field army had been annihilated. Logic said the war was over. But Rome didn't surrender. Instead, the Senate enacted emergency measures that revealed the true character of Roman civilization. They freed and armed 8,000 slaves to form new legions. They sent envoys to every Italian city still loyal to Rome, demanding troops and supplies. They forbade public mourning. Grief was a private matter. The Republic needed to project strength. Most incredibly, they refused to ransom the $10,000 Roman prisoners Hannibal had captured. The Senate declared that soldiers who allowed themselves to be captured rather than fighting to the death had forfeited their citizenship. It was brutal, but it sent a message. Rome would rather lose citizens than show weakness. Hannibal, watching from his camp, reportedly said, "Rome doesn't know how to win. But they also don't know how to lose. He had destroyed their army, but he couldn't break their will. That distinction would define the rest of the war. August 6th, 216 BC. One day after receiving Varro's dispatch, the Senate convened in emergency session at dawn. The room held only 21 senators. 80 of their colleagues lay dead at Cannae. The remaining senators faced a crisis that would have broken most civilizations. They had lost 60% of their military-age male population in a single afternoon. Their treasury was strained from funding the destroyed army. Panic was spreading through the city as families learned that fathers, sons, and brothers were dead. Any rational government would have sued for peace, paid tribute, accepted Carthaginian dominance. The Senate voted instead to continue the war. The vote was unanimous, 220 to 0. Here's where Rome's response became genuinely unprecedented. The Senate passed the Lex Oppia, emergency legislation that freed and armed 8,000 slaves to form 2 new legions, the legiones vernaculi. Think about what this meant. Roman military tradition strictly prohibited slaves from military service. Citizenship was a prerequisite for bearing arms. But Rome was so desperate for manpower that they shattered a centuries-old taboo. The freed slaves weren't granted full citizenship. They remained a separate, stigmatized class. But they were given weapons and told to defend the Republic. The cost was enormous. Freeing 8,000 slaves meant compensating their owners at market rates, roughly 500 denarii per slave. That's 4 million denarii, roughly 7% of Rome's annual revenue spent in a single day to create 2 legions. But Rome didn't stop there. They sent emergency requisitions to every allied Italian city. Bring troops, bring supplies, bring gold. Refusal would be considered treachery. Some cities complied out of loyalty. Others complied out of terror. If Rome fell, they'd face Hannibal alone. Within 2 weeks, Rome had assembled 25,000 fresh troops, cobbled together from allies, freed slaves, and boys as young as 16 who'd been below the normal conscription age of 17. Here's what the chronicles rarely emphasize. Rome's decision to refuse ransom for the 10,000 captured soldiers was arguably more brutal than anything Hannibal did at Cannae. Hannibal sent an envoy to Rome offering to return the prisoners in exchange for ransom, standard practice in ancient warfare. The going rate was roughly 300 denarii per soldier, which meant Rome could have recovered their 10,000 captured men for 3 million denarii. The Senate voted to refuse, not because they couldn't afford it, but because paying ransom would signal weakness. It would suggest Rome valued individual lives over collective victory. The captured soldiers, when they learned Rome had abandoned them, faced a choice: slavery under Carthaginian masters or death. Most were sold into slavery throughout the Mediterranean. They would spend years in chains, knowing their own republic had sentenced them to that fate. It was calculated cruelty designed to send a message to every Roman soldier. Surrender is not an option. Fight to the death or be forsaken. The Senate also passed laws forbidding public displays of mourning. Women were prohibited from wailing in the streets. Funerals were limited to immediate family. The city needed to project strength and normalcy, not grief and panic. Imagine that psychological burden. Nearly every family in Rome had lost someone at Cannae, and they were forbidden from mourning publicly. Grief became a private, hidden thing. By August 20th, 18 days after Cannae, Rome had accomplished something that shouldn't have been possible. They had fielded a new army of 25,000 men. They had fortified the city walls. They had secured supply lines from Sicily and Sardinia. They had reasserted control over wavering allied cities. The republic that should have collapsed had instead reconstituted itself through sheer, bloody-minded refusal to accept defeat. Hannibal, camped at Cannae, sorting through 80,000 pounds of captured equipment, received reports of Rome's response with something like disbelief. He had just delivered the perfect tactical victory. He had killed 50,000 Romans in a single afternoon. And Rome's response was to raise another army and dare him to do it again. That's when Hannibal reportedly made his famous observation: Rome doesn't know how to win, but they also don't know how to lose. The question now was whether Hannibal would march on Rome and test that defiance. His cavalry commander Hannibal was urging immediate action. But Hannibal hesitated. That hesitation would define the rest of the war, and ultimately, Carthage's defeat. Here's the question that has haunted historians for 200 years. Why didn't Hannibal march on Rome immediately after Cannae? His army was victorious. Rome's defenses were shattered. The city was in panic. One of his cavalry commanders, Hannibal, reportedly urged him, "March now, and in 5 days you'll be dining in the capital." Hannibal refused. His reasons remain debated, but the most likely explanation is logistical. His army had no siege equipment. Rome's walls were formidable, and even after Cannae, Rome could still field troops from its Italian allies. Hannibal calculated that laying siege to Rome would be a grinding, costly affair with no guarantee of success. Instead, he hoped Cannae would break Rome's alliances. He hoped Italian cities would defect to Carthage, isolating Rome politically and economically. Some cities did defect. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, switched sides. But most remained loyal to Rome out of fear or calculation. Hannibal's response to Hannibal's hesitation became famous. "The gods have not given everything to one man. You know how to win victories, Hannibal. You do not know how to use them." That single decision, to not march on Rome immediately after Cannae, may have cost Carthage the war. August 3rd, 216 BC, the morning after Cannae. Hannibal finds Hannibal standing alone on the battlefield, surveying 50,000 Roman corpses. The cavalry commander's proposal is bold and immediate. "Give me 5,000 cavalry. I'll reach Rome in 4 days. You follow with the infantry. We'll be inside the city within a week." The logic seems irrefutable. Rome is 250 miles north. Hannibal's army is intact and victorious. Roman morale is shattered. The window of opportunity will never be wider than right now, in this moment, before Rome can recover. Hannibal listens, then shakes his head. No. Here's what made Hannibal's calculation more complex than it appears. Rome's walls, the Servian Wall, stretched 11 kilometers around the city, roughly 7 miles of fortification, 10 meters high and 4 meters thick. Taking those walls would require siege equipment, battering rams, siege towers, catapults. Hannibal had none of that. He'd crossed the Alps traveling light, sacrificing heavy siege gear for mobility. Building siege equipment in hostile territory would take months and require vast quantities of timber, rope, and skilled engineers. And during that time, Rome would be mobilizing every allied city in Italy to attack his siege lines. The numbers told a sobering story. Hannibal's army, even after Cannae, numbered approximately 44,000 men. He'd lost 6,000 in the battle. Besieging a city of 400,000 people with 44,000 troops meant a ratio of roughly 9.1 against him. Rome could arm every adult male in the city and outnumber him 4.1. Historical precedent suggested that sieges required at least 3.1 numerical superiority for the attacker. Hannibal would be attempting the inverse, laying siege while vastly outnumbered. But here's what military historians argue Hannibal missed: Rome's psychological state. The city was in panic. Families were mourning 50,000 dead. The Senate was divided. If Hannibal had appeared outside the walls with his victorious army within a week of Cannae, the terror alone might have broken Roman resistance. But Hannibal was thinking tactically: walls, numbers, logistics, when he needed to think psychologically. Fear is a weapon, and Cannae had given him the ultimate terror weapon. He let it expire unused. Instead, Hannibal pursued a political strategy. He would break Rome's Italian alliances, isolate the city, and force surrender through economic strangulation rather than military assault. It was a reasonable plan. It almost worked. Capua, Italy's second-largest city with a population of 50,000, defected to Carthage within weeks of Cannae. So did several smaller cities in southern Italy: Arpi, Salapia, Herdonia, Locri. In a total, roughly 400,000 Italians, about 10% of the peninsula's population, switched allegiance from Rome to Carthage. But here's what Hannibal hadn't accounted for. Most Italian cities stayed loyal to Rome. Not out of love, many hated Roman dominance, but out of calculation. They'd seen what happened to cities that resisted Rome in previous wars: total destruction, enslavement of populations, salting of fields. Rome's reputation for absolute, merciless vengeance kept most cities loyal even after Cannae. They figured Rome might lose to Hannibal, but if Rome won, traitor cities would be annihilated. Better to stay loyal and hope Rome survived. August 15th, 216 BC. 2 weeks after Cannae, Hannibal confronts Hannibal again, this time with barely concealed frustration. Capua has defected. Other cities are wavering, but Rome is mobilizing. The window is closing. "We should march now," Hannibal insists. "Every day we wait, Rome grows stronger." Hannibal refuses again. His army needs rest. His supply lines need securing. The political situation needs time to develop. That's when Hannibal delivers his famous rebuke, recorded by Roman historian Livy. "Truly the gods have not bestowed all things on the same person. You know how to win a victory, Hannibal. You do not know how to use one." The words stung because they were true. Hannibal was a tactical genius, perhaps the greatest battlefield commander in history. But strategy required something different: understanding when to abandon perfect plans in favor of bold, imperfect action. Hannibal chose caution. He chose to wait, to consolidate, to let political pressure do what military force might accomplish more quickly. It was the wrong choice. Rome didn't collapse politically. Rome got stronger. And Hannibal's perfect victory at Cannae became a hollow achievement, spectacular, deadly, and ultimately meaningless. The war would drag on for 14 more years, and Carthage would lose. All because Hannibal won the perfect battle, but failed to exploit it. Military historians call Cannae the most studied battle in history, and for good reason. Hannibal invented, or at least perfected, the double envelopment, a tactical maneuver that remains the ideal of battlefield success 2,200 years later. The concept is simple, but devastatingly effective. Fix the enemy's attention in the center while attacking from the flanks and rear, surrounding and destroying them. Every military academy in the world still teaches Cannae. The German Wehrmacht studied it before executing similar envelopments in World War II during the early Blitzkrieg campaigns. The U.S. military's left hook maneuver during the 1991 Gulf War was essentially a modern mechanized version of Cannae. What made Hannibal's execution perfect was the coordination required. The center had to retreat at exactly the right pace. Too fast and the Romans wouldn't follow. Too slow and the center would collapse. The flanking African infantry had to hold position until the perfect moment. The cavalry had to defeat the Roman wings, then wheel around and attack the rear in perfect timing. One mistake, one unit breaking formation, and the entire plan collapses. Hannibal executed it flawlessly with 50,000 men from half a dozen different ethnic groups who spoke different languages. That's battlefield command at its absolute peak. Here's why Cannae became the template for military perfection. The double envelopment achieves something that almost no other tactical formation can: complete destruction of the enemy force. Not defeat, not retreat, total annihilation. In most ancient battles, the losing side would break formation and flee, suffering perhaps 10 to 20% casualties. At Cannae, the Romans suffered 70–80% casualties because they couldn't flee. The encirclement turned retreat into impossibility. That's why every general for the next 2,200 years dreamed of replicating it. But here's what makes Cannae so difficult to copy. It requires 5 separate maneuvers to execute perfectly in sequence. First, your center must absorb the enemy's initial assault without collapsing. Hannibal's Gauls held for 90 minutes while taking massive casualties. Second, your flanking units must remain stationary and disciplined while the center suffers. Hannibal's African veterans stood motionless for 90 minutes, watching their comrades die. Third, your cavalry must defeat the enemy cavalry quickly enough to wheel around before the infantry battle is decided. Hannibal's cavalry destroyed Rome's wings in 25 minutes. Fourth, the center must retreat at exactly the right pace to draw the enemy deep enough. Hannibal's Gauls gave ground at roughly 10 yards per 5 minutes. Fifth, the flanking infantry and cavalry must attack simultaneously from 3 directions with perfect timing. One mistake in any phase, and the entire plan fails. Think about the coordination required. Hannibal commanded Gauls who spoke Celtic dialects, Iberians who spoke pre-Latin languages, Numidians who spoke Berber, and Greeks who spoke, well, Greek. His officers gave commands in Punic, the Carthaginian language. Unit cohesion came from 3 years of campaigning together, not from shared language or culture. And yet they executed the most complex tactical maneuver in military history without modern communications, without radios, without any way to coordinate except pre-arranged signals and trust. The legacy is staggering. In 1805, Napoleon studied Cannae before attempting a similar double envelopment at Austerlitz. He succeeded, destroying the combined Austrian-Russian army. In 1914, the German Schlieffen Plan was essentially an attempt to execute Cannae on a national scale, envelop the French army through Belgium, and destroy it in one decisive battle. It failed, but the attempt shows Cannae's influence. In 1940, the Wehrmacht succeeded where the Schlieffen Plan failed, executing multiple Cannae-style envelopments during the fall of France, most notably at the Dunkirk pocket where 400,000 Allied troops were surrounded and would have been annihilated if not for the miraculous evacuation. In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, General Norman Schwarzkopf explicitly invoked Cannae when designing the left hook maneuver. U.S. forces fixed Iraqi attention on Kuwait while the main attack swept west through the desert, then turned east to envelop the Republican Guard divisions from behind. The Iraqi forces, surrounded on 3 sides with nowhere to retreat, were destroyed in 100 hours. Schwarzkopf later said, "We studied Cannae at West Point. Every officer studies Cannae. This was our chance to execute it with tanks instead of cavalry." Modern military doctrine codifies Cannae's principles in terms like penetration and envelopment, vertical envelopment, using helicopters or paratroopers to attack the rear, and decisive points. The U.S. Army's Field Manual 3.0 explicitly teaches commanders to seek opportunities for envelopment when enemy forces are fixed or overextended. The language has changed, but the concept remains identical. Surround your enemy, cut off retreat, destroy them completely. But here's the uncomfortable truth that military historians grapple with. Cannae was tactically perfect and strategically meaningless. Hannibal achieved the ideal battle, the one every general dreams of, and it didn't win him the war. That paradox, that perfection isn't enough, haunts military thought to this day. Tactical brilliance without strategic vision produces spectacular corpses, not victory. Cannae proved you can win the perfect battle and still lose everything that matters. Let's put the casualties at Cannae into perspective with numbers that make the scale viscerally real. 50,000 to 70,000 Romans died in approximately 6 hours. That's 10,000 deaths per hour, 166 deaths per minute, nearly 3 deaths every second for 6 straight hours. If you tried to count the dead at Cannae, spending just 1 second per body, it would take you 14 hours of continuous counting. Modern historians estimate that roughly 20% of all Roman military-age males died at Cannae in a single afternoon. The social impact was catastrophic. Nearly every Roman family lost someone, a father, brother, son. Entire generations were wiped out. The Senate had to lower the property requirements for military service because there weren't enough eligible men left. Rome had to free slaves and arm them as soldiers. The psychological trauma lasted decades. For an entire generation of Romans, the name Hannibal was synonymous with nightmare. Mothers would quiet crying children by saying, "Hannibal will come for you." The terror was that visceral, that permanent. Rome had been humiliated, devastated, and brought to the edge of extinction. And yet somehow, impossibly, they survived. Here's another way to understand the scale. Rome's total population in 216 BC was approximately 4 million people across the Republic and its territories. Of those, roughly 400,000 lived in Rome itself. Adult males of military age, 17 to 46 years old, represented about 25% of the male population, or roughly 500,000 men across the entire Republic. Cannae killed 50,000 to 70,000 of them in 6 hours. That's 10–14% of Rome's entire military-age male population dead in a single afternoon. Think about what that means demographically. Every family, every neighborhood, every trade guild lost members. The textile workshops lost weavers. The construction crews lost laborers. The farms lost hands for the harvest. The social fabric tore in ways that would take a generation to repair. The age breakdown makes it worse. Most legionaries were men in their 20s and early 30s. Prime working age, prime fathering age. These weren't elderly men at the end of productive life. They were men who should have had decades ahead of them. They left behind widows, often pregnant. They left behind children who would grow up fatherless. They left behind parents who would die, knowing their family lines might end. Roman census records from 209 BC, 7 years after Cannae, show a population decline of approximately 17% in citizen households. That's not just from battlefield deaths. That's from the cascading demographic collapse. Fewer marriages, fewer births, higher infant mortality as stressed mothers struggled without support. Here's what the chronicles rarely discuss: the economic devastation. Each dead legionary represented lost economic productivity. A skilled craftsman might earn 3 to 4 denarii per day. Over a 40-year working life, that's 40,000 plus denarii of lost economic output per person. Multiply that by 50,000 deaths, and Rome lost approximately 2 billion denarii in future economic productivity, roughly 35 times the Republic's annual revenue. The real economic cost was probably even higher when you factor in lost inheritance, abandoned farms, and disrupted trade networks. The psychological trauma manifested in ways that ancient sources documented extensively. Roman parents who'd named children Marcus or Gaius, common names, now hesitated, knowing those names appeared on the casualty lists from Cannae. Baby boys born in 215 BC were given Greek names at unusually high rates. Alexander, Philip, Ptolemy. Perhaps parents' attempts to distance their children from Roman identity, tainted by catastrophic defeat. Dream interpretation texts from the period show Romans obsessed with nightmares about being surrounded, crushed, unable to move. Clear trauma symptoms matching what happened at Cannae. The cultural impact lasted for centuries. Roman historians writing 200 years after Cannae still referred to it as the day Rome died and was reborn. Philosophers used Cannae as the ultimate example of fortuna, fate's cruel randomness. Why did 70 Romans escape with Varro while 50,000 others died? Pure chance. There was no justice in it, no moral lesson, just random death on incomprehensible scale. That realization, that catastrophe, could strike arbitrarily, haunted Roman thought for generations. But here's the truly incomprehensible part. Rome survived. A civilization that lost 20% of its military-age males in a single afternoon, that saw its political leadership decapitated, that faced economic collapse and demographic disaster. That civilization looked at total catastrophe and decided to keep fighting. Not because victory seemed possible, but because surrender was unthinkable. That's the human story beneath the statistics. 50,000 dead Romans, and the republic that should have died with them instead became an empire. Somehow, loss became fuel for survival rather than justification for surrender. Here's the ultimate paradox of Cannae. Hannibal won the perfect tactical victory, but lost the strategic war. After Cannae, the war dragged on for another 14 years. Rome rebuilt their legions. They adopted a strategy of attrition, avoiding large battles and instead harassing Hannibal's forces, cutting his supply lines, and retaking allied cities one by one. Rome sent armies to Spain and Africa, forcing Carthage to fight on multiple fronts. Eventually, Hannibal was recalled to defend Carthage itself, where he was defeated at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. Carthage sued for peace. The empire was broken. Rome, the civilization that should have collapsed after Cannae, instead emerged as the dominant Mediterranean power. Why? Because Rome had something Carthage didn't: infinite will and bottomless manpower reserves. Rome could absorb catastrophic losses and keep fighting. Carthage couldn't. Cannae was the perfect battle, but perfect battles don't win wars. Endurance does. Resources do. The will to keep standing when any rational civilization would surrender, that wins wars. Hannibal taught Rome how to lose. Rome taught the world how to refuse defeat. In the end, that was the lesson of Cannae. Tactical brilliance can destroy armies, but only strategic depth can destroy nations. 217 BC. 1 year after Cannae, Rome appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, emergency wartime leader with absolute authority. Fabius implemented what became known as the Fabian strategy. Avoid pitched battles with Hannibal at all costs. Instead, shadow his army, harass his supply lines, attack his foraging parties, and retake cities that had defected. It was unglamorous, frustrating warfare. Romans mocked Fabius, calling him cunctator, the delayer. But it worked. Hannibal could win every tactical engagement, but he couldn't force Rome to surrender if Rome refused to fight him. Here's where the strategic math became decisive. Rome could field multiple armies simultaneously. After Cannae, Rome raised not one but 4 new legions, roughly 25,000 men. By 215 BC, they had 6 legions operating in Italy alone, plus additional forces in Spain, Sicily, and Sardinia. Total Roman military strength by 215 BC, approximately 100,000 soldiers. Hannibal's army in Italy, 40,000 men with no reinforcements. Think about that disparity. Rome lost 50,000 men at Cannae, and within a year had fielded twice that number across multiple theaters. Carthage couldn't match that. The Carthaginian Senate, dominated by merchant factions more interested in trade than conquest, refused to send Hannibal significant reinforcements. He was winning battles with an army that slowly bled away through attrition. 218-206 BC. While Hannibal rampaged through Italy, Rome opened a second front in Spain. The Scipio brothers, Publius and Gnaeus, commanded Roman forces that systematically conquered Carthaginian territory in Iberia. They cut off the resources, Spanish silver mines, Iberian manpower, that Carthage needed to sustain the war. When the Scipio brothers were killed in 211 BC, Rome sent their son, Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, age 25, to continue the campaign. By 206 BC, Spain was Roman. Hannibal's strategic base was gone. 204 BC, Scipio Africanus, now Rome's greatest general, did what Hannibal had done to Rome. He invaded the enemy's homeland. Roman legions landed in North Africa near Carthage itself. Suddenly, Carthage faced existential threat. The Carthaginian Senate recalled Hannibal from Italy after 15 years of campaigning. The man who'd won every major battle was being summoned home to defend a capital he'd left as a young commander. The strategic initiative had completely reversed. October 19th, 202, the BC, the Battle of Zama, 75 miles southwest of Carthage. Hannibal commanded approximately 36,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, his last army. Scipio commanded 29,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, plus Numidian allies who'd switched sides. The battle was Cannae in reverse. Scipio used Hannibal's own tactics against him. He strengthened his flanks, weakened his center deliberately, and used superior cavalry to envelop Hannibal's forces. When the dust settled, Hannibal had suffered his first and only decisive battlefield defeat. Carthaginian casualties, 20,000 dead, 15,000 captured. Roman casualties, 1,500. The numbers tell the story of why Rome won. Over 17 years of war, 218-201 BC, Rome suffered approximately 300,000 total casualties, military and civilian combined. Carthage suffered perhaps 100,000, but Rome's population base was roughly 4 million. Carthage's was 1 million. Rome could replace losses. Carthage couldn't. Rome had allies who contributed troops even after defeats. Carthage's allies defected after losses. Rome controlled vast agricultural territories in Italy that kept feeding armies. Carthage depended on overseas trade that Rome's navy disrupted. But here's the deeper truth. Rome won because Romans decided losing Cannae didn't mean losing the war. That psychological resilience, the absolute refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat seemed rational, proved more powerful than any tactical genius. Hannibal was the better general. His soldiers were more experienced. His tactics were superior. But Rome had something Carthage lacked: institutional endurance. The Senate kept raising armies. The people kept sending sons to war. The allies kept providing troops. That systemic capacity to absorb catastrophic losses and continue functioning, that's what won the Second Punic War. Hannibal spent his final years in exile, a mercenary general serving various kings, always one step ahead of Roman assassins. He died in 183 BC, poisoned rather than captured, defiant to the end. Rome went on to conquer the Mediterranean, building an empire that lasted 700 years. Cannae became a historical footnote, the perfect battle that ultimately meant nothing. And that's the final lesson. Winning doesn't matter if you can't translate tactical success into strategic victory. Brilliance is wonderful. Endurance is essential. Rome had both.